On this Passion Time special, we interview a young Time magazine journalist, J. Newton Small, whose recent book, Broad Influence, How Women Are Changing the Way America Works, explains the role American women will play in this very important and unprecedented election, and why women may prove Republican candidate Donald Trump's weakest link. We met up at the Columbian School of Journalism Alumni Weekend, which happens every year. And if you hear a lot of noise in the background, it's because this band was playing. Not too bad for a university which is better known for its academics than its party atmosphere.
I'm here with J. Newton Small. She's from the class of 2001. I'm from class of 90. I'm a lot older than you. And she's the author of Broad Influence, How Women Are Changing the Way America Works, Washington correspondent for Time, and she writes about everything from Washington politics to foreign policy and national trends. Thank you for joining us in Passion Time. I'd like to know, obviously you're a very good journalist. So how did you find that passion?
Well, I actually fell into journalism. I studied art history undergraduate, and I did an internship my senior year at a auction house, and I kind of had this appalling realization that art history was sort of about sucking up to rich people. Sorry, whomever is in art. And
I like about you.
and I didn't want to do it for the rest of my life, so I randomly was dragged to a talk by a journalist named Neil Shapiro, who was with Dayline NBC, and he talked about how journalism was the art of the curious. And I thought, well, I'm a really curious person, so I ended up actually going to intern with Neil after graduation, and I realized I wanted to become a journalist, but I'd never actually written anything, so I came to Columbia Graduate School of Journalism, and learned journalism after that.
Now, you've just written, I'm assuming this is your first book.
Yeah.
Why did you pick a topic about women and politics? What's going on?
So about 2.5 years ago, I wrote a story for Time magazine. I write for Time about the women of the Senate coming together during the government shutdown to restart the negotiations tree up in the government when none of the men would talk to each other. I had a lot of interest in writing a book about the women of the Senate, but the women of the Senate were all writing their own books, and they didn't actually need one from me. What interested me most about that episode, though, was that it was the first time the women of the Senate women made up 20% of the Senate. There were 20 female senators, and they actually chaired or ranked on 11 of the 20 committees, so they were incredibly powerful. And they had a huge impact that session. They ended up producing 75% of the legislation that passed that session. So it turns out there's a thing called critical mass. So somewhere between 20 and 30% in any body, whether it's a legislature or a corporate board, a Navy ship, or an appellate court, and women really begin to have an impact. They begin to change the way things are done. My book gathers all those areas where women have reached this tipping point, and it looks at the changes that they are making, and then it looks at the places where we are still very far away from it, like Wall Street or Silicon Valley, and why it's essential that we get there.
Yeah, I interviewed Senator Hutchinson about that. They had lunches together. They work differently than men in politics. Now, you also mentioned something today about women and how they're going to vote in this election. What have you found?
So the women's vote is very powerful. It's swung every election since Ronald Reagan, and it's actually a vote that tends to trend more Democratic than Republican. So 53% of the electorate are female, and they vote 10% more than men do. They tend to trend Democratic, so in order for Republicans to win the White House, and they have to mitigate the loss of women to Democrats to less than 5 percentage points. With George W. Bush did this with his security moms push, soccer moms push. And with this cycle, it's really fascinating because the women's vote is obviously very much in play, and it's being much more talked about than ever before, especially since you have on the left the first potential female president or female nominee, and then on the right Donald Trump, who has sort of to historic proportions put off women voters. So women by and large disapprove of Donald Trump by 73 percentage points, which is an almost insurmountable deficit with a single demographic that makes it almost disqualifying for him to be president. So it's a fascinating kind of time to be a woman voter and to be writing about women voters.
You know, it is a fascinating time, and these elections are very fascinating and strange in a way. What have been some of the biggest, you've been covering, what, since 2004, the White House and politics, national politics. What has been the most surprising for you, do you think, in the past, what you've seen this year in the campaign?
I think I'm most surprised, the sort of Teflon nature of Donald Trump. I mean, he manages to insult like large swaths of the electorate and nobody bats an eyelash. It's kind of amazing. I mean, veterans talking about how he was sort of like cavalier about how he didn't like the fact that, John McCain had been caught as a POW. Women with Megyn Kelly and his insults to her and Rosie O'Donnell and any number of women. Latinos calling Mexicans rapists and murderers, calling for the suspension of Muslims to come into America after the Paris attacks. I mean, and frankly, almost sympathizing with the KKK and Donald, and David Duke with African American voters. I mean, it's just amazing to me how many people he can insult and still manage to win millions of voters.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think he is able to do that? Are we becoming a less civil society, or he's just kind of new and different and non-establishment?
I think there's two things, or a few things. One is that, frankly, his main demographic is white men. So, I mean, he's having a lot of trouble sort of expanding and will, I think, continue to have trouble expanding that demographic. And while you can win Republican primaries on the backs of the support of largely white men, especially when your competition is split, winning a general election just on the backs of white men is almost impossible. I think it's also a matter of reality TV, in this election, and people think it's entertainment. People don't think he's being serious. They're like, of course he doesn't really believe that. He's just saying it, it's like no big deal. Like, it's just being funny, it's entertaining. And so there is this aspect that, it's like of irreality of the election that, what he says isn't substantive, and a lot of this is just sort of like, yet another part of the game show that goes on.
Have you been able to speak to people about the anger that's, in a way, has catapulted Trump and even Bernie Sanders, the anger that's out there?
Sure. I mean, look, there is a huge amount of, discontent with a large swath of the American people, not just on the right wing, but also on the left wing. Although you see it much more tangibly on the right side, especially there's a large, whether it's the Tea Partiers or folks who are just anti-establishment, they've elected 3 classes of Tea Party members of Congress now who have been promising radical change, and that radical change has not been delivered, and it just makes them increasingly discontent. And so with every successive election and every successive failure to stop Obamacare, to end Dodd-Frank, to impeach Obama, this electorate gets more and more and more upset. And it's very hard because in this era of instantaneous gratification on just about every other level, government is not built to move quickly. It is a system of checks and balances that makes it very hard for really anybody to deliver on these promises of rapid change.
You mentioned something else, and then I'll let you go. I know you have things to do, but you mentioned that the Koch brothers are donating $900 million to Senate races.
So they're going to spend about $900 million in this campaign. About 2/3 of that will go directly towards the elections. The other third will be in advocacy of issues. But almost all of that money will go, whether it's advocacy issues or Senate campaigns, almost all of that will go towards the House and the Senate. Almost none of that money will go to the presidential election. They've said, through various statements that they think the tone of this election is not what they'd like to see, and unless the candidate, meaning Donald Trump, changes his tone and starts talking about specific policy issues that they'd like to see addressed, that they're going to sit this presidential election out.
You don't think that's going to happen? Do you think he's going to start talking issues?
You saw him today write a Wall Street Journal editorial that was much more mild-mannered, relatively speaking, than his previous kind of editorials and previous statements. Had no exclamation points for the first time ever. But whether, and frankly, the New York Post endorsement yesterday said that, their endorsement was contingent on him acting more presidential. But the fact of the matter is, him acting presidential isn't what makes him popular, and it isn't what gets him ratings and money. So I think it's a very hard thing for him. It's a very hard, balance to acting presidential and boring versus acting bombastic and interesting. One gets him what he wants, which is attention and money. The other potentially gets him more votes, but I'm not sure that that's what he's aiming for in this place.
My last question is about women, and Hillary being a female candidate, she still doesn't have the support of a lot of young women. Is there a double standard when it comes to men and women in politics, do you think?
I mean, yes, it's much harder for women to run, female candidates to run, and you see this in this cycle. And it's subtle sexisms. I mean, that I didn't even, in writing the book, I didn't even anticipate. And in the chapter that I have about Hillary, and I interviewed Hillary for the book, and she talked, to me about the challenges and sexism of being a female candidate. And this time around, it's really interesting because, you see Bernie Sanders on the left, and he will yell at you for like 40 minutes, and you're like, yeah, yell at me more. It's like really passionate and inspiring. And Hillary tries to yell to show passion, and people are like, why is mom screaming at me? They're like, oh my God, I'm in trouble. And it's like this, it comes off as shrill and screaming and shouting. And it's because we as a people have these subtle sexisms that like connotate in our heads that when women yell, it's usually like we're in trouble or it's bad. And so, but it also makes it very, very hard for her to show passion and to show that she's truly passionately dedicated to changing the country. Likewise, we expect our women to be pragmatic, and they have this very pragmatic role that they play in our households and in our lives. And so, whereas Bernie can be a dreamer and come up with a $15 trillion plan for healthcare reform, if Hillary comes up with sort of pie in the sky plans, everyone's like, oh my God, Hillary, what are you doing? And so, she's held to a very different standard than Bernie is in these kinds of things, and it makes it, hard because she ends up being forced into playing this role of, the mom who says like, no honey, we can't afford that jet ski, we need to like save for college. And and that's a very uninspiring, very really tough role to run for president on.
Pragmatic, very pragmatic.
Yeah.
All right, Ms. Newton Small, there's nothing small about you. She is the author of Broad Influence, How Women Are Changing the Way America Works. So get it right now. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yo sé que tú puedes, que tú eres capaz. Cambia tu vida. La vida es una y tú vas a triunfar. Cambia tu vida. Con fe y esperanza, las puertas